If you were alive in Britain, or watching British culture from across the Atlantic, between the 1960s and the early 2000s, then the men in this video were not strangers to you. They were practically family. You knew their faces better than your neighbors' faces. You knew their voices. You knew their catchphrases. And when they fell ill, or retired, or passed away, you felt it. Genuinely felt it. And that is precisely what makes what we are about to explore so deeply uncomfortable, so deeply important. Because behind every single man on this list, there was a woman, or in some cases, several women, and even children, living in a quiet, invisible nightmare. Not one of these women was believed straight away. Not one of them received the sympathy that the man beside them received from the public. And in far too many cases, these women were dismissed, belittled, and silenced, while the man they had accused was handed an award, a knighthood, or a standing ovation. We are going to change that narrative today. Before we go any further, if this video is giving you something to think about, if you appreciate honest, unflinching storytelling like this, please take a second right now, tap that subscribe button, and give this video a like. It genuinely helps more people find this content. And frankly, more people need to hear it. Now, let us begin. Number 1, Sir Sean Connery. Let us start at the very top. The man who, for an entire generation, was quite simply the definition of cool. If you were a man in the 1960s, you wanted to be him. If you were a woman, the culture told you that you wanted to be with him. His name was Sean Connery, and as the original James Bond, he became something that very few human beings ever truly become. He became a myth. That voice, low and commanding, with the unmistakable Edinburgh lilt, that raised eyebrow that could silence a room, the tuxedo, the Aston Martin, the effortless authority. He was the ultimate alpha male, and the world adored him for it. But here is what the world chose not to see. His first wife, the talented actress Diane Cilento, who in her own right was nominated for an Academy Award for her performance in Tom Jones, lived a reality that was nothing like a Bond film, unless you count The Terror. In her autobiography, My 9 Lives, Cilento described a marriage, which began in 1962, that was defined from an early stage by Connery's explosive temper. She recounted harrowing incidents, including a violent physical attack in a hotel room in Spain, that shattered every illusion of the glamorous life the public believed they were living. But what makes Sean Connery's story different from almost any other on this list is that he didn't merely deny it. He justified it. Publicly. Repeatedly. And without a single trace of shame. In 1965, at the absolute height of his fame as Bond, he sat down with Playboy magazine and calmly stated that he saw nothing particularly wrong with striking a woman, although he would specify, with chilling precision, that you wouldn't do it the same way you'd hit a man. An open-handed slap, he explained, was acceptable if a woman was being, as he put it, hysterical. The world read it. The world read it. And the world, largely, moved on. Because it was the 60s. Because he was Bond. Because the culture said, well, that's just how men talk. But then came 1987. 22 years later. A time when domestic violence was finally being treated as the crime it had always been. Barbara Walters sat across from him on American television and gave him every opportunity to walk those comments back. He doubled down. He told a visibly stunned Barbara Walters that he had not changed his view. That if a woman insisted on having the last word, and you let her have it, but she continued to argue, then striking her was, in his words, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Let that sit with you for a moment. While Sean Connery was receiving standing ovations, winning an Academy Award for The Untouchables, and being knighted by the Queen. Diane Cilento was spending decades rebuilding a confidence and a career that had been systematically dismantled inside that marriage. The press often called her a bitter ex-wife. The industry protected its golden boy, and the conspiracy of silence held firm. Sean Connery died in 2020, eulogized across the world as a legend of cinema, a national treasure, a giant of the screen. And he was all of those things. That is the uncomfortable truth. He was also a man who used those famous hands, not just to hold a Walther PPK on screen, but to hurt the woman he had sworn to cherish. We remember both now. Or at least, we should. Number 2, George Best. If you were British in the late 1960s, there was simply no one like him. George Best. The fifth Beatle, as the press called him. A working-class boy from the Craigac estate in Belfast, who walked into Old Trafford and turned football into something that went far beyond sport. He had the dark hair, the film star looks, the feet that seemed to move at a different speed to every other player on the pitch. In 1968, the year Manchester United lifted the European Cup, he was arguably the most famous man in Britain. And he knew it. And the nation loved him for knowing it. The lifestyle became the legend. The champagne. The cars. The nightclubs. The women. He once quipped, with that irresistible grin, that he'd spent his money on booze, birds, and fast cars, and squandered the rest. And Britain roared with laughter, because that was George. Lovable. Naughty. Irresistible George. But here is what the laughter drowned out. George Best was a man in the grip of a severe alcohol addiction. And behind the doors of his home, that addiction was the fuel for something that his public image was entirely built to conceal. A terrifying, sustained pattern of violence against the women who loved him. His first wife, the model Angie Best, whom he met in the United States during the 1970s, described a life that was unrecognizable from the glamorous photographs the tabloids printed. She spoke of walking on permanent eggshells, of a man who, in the morning, could be the most generous and tender soul imaginable, and who, by the evening, once the alcohol had taken hold, became someone she did not recognize at all. The jealousy was pathological. He viewed the women in his life not as partners, but as possessions, trophies, and any perceived challenge to that ownership, a glance from another man, a moment of independence, could light the fuse. By the time George met and married Alex Best in the 1990s, the golden boy of football was a shadow of what he had been on the pitch, but his capacity for violence had not diminished. In her autobiography, Always Alex, she described incidents that shocked the nation when they finally came to light. Hair dragged across rooms, punches, kicks, and on one occasion, in a drunken rage in a hotel room, being cut across the face with a set of keys. A cowardly and brutal attack on a woman who had devoted herself to trying to save his life. And yet, the tabloids, more often than not, framed the story as poor George and his battle with the bottle. The focus was always on his suffering, rarely on hers. He was the tragic genius. She was a footnote. He was given pass after pass, because he had scored that goal in the European Cup final. Because he was George. And George was untouchable. George Best died in 2005, and Belfast came to a standstill. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets. The eulogies were magnificent. They spoke of his dribbling, his goals, his charisma, his joy. Very few mentioned Alex, or Angie, or what they had endured. George Best was, without question, one of the greatest footballers who ever lived. That is not in dispute. But talent on a football pitch is not a character reference. And the lovable rogue was, for the women who shared his home, anything but lovable. Number 3, John Lennon. This one, for many of you watching, will be the hardest. Because John Lennon is not simply a famous man. To millions of people who came of age in the 1960s and 70s, he is something closer to a secular saint. He is Imagine. He is Give Peace a Chance. He is the man in the white suit, sitting in bed in Amsterdam with Yoko Ono, holding up a sign for peace. He is the round glasses, the gentle smile, the working-class hero who spoke truth to power and paid for it with his life. And all of that is real. All of that happened. But here is what else is real. What Lennon himself, in the end, admitted. In a candid Playboy interview in 1980, just weeks before his assassination, he looked his interviewer in the eye and said plainly, "I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself. And I hit. I fought men. And I hit women." His own words. His own confession. His first wife, Cynthia Powell, whom he met at Art College in Liverpool in the late 1950s, lived with a man defined by a possessive, volcanic jealousy. Early in their relationship, in a corridor, because she had simply danced with his friend Stuart Sutcliffe, he struck her across the face. It was, as she wrote in her memoir, the beginning of a pattern that would define the entire marriage. He demanded total loyalty, total submission. He expected Cynthia to reshape herself around his desires, while he remained entirely free to pursue his own. And when she didn't meet his exacting, contradictory standards, he used his tongue, or his hands, to make her feel it. What makes Lennon's story particularly haunting is that the evidence was there, hidden in plain sight, in the music itself. Run for Your Life, from the Rubber Soul album in 1965, contains the line, "I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man." Millions tapped their feet to that melody. Nobody asked questions. And in Getting Better, he confesses directly, "I used to be cruel to my woman. I beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved." It is there. It has always been there. We simply chose not to hear it. His assassination in December 1980 froze him forever in time as the apostle of peace. And the world, understandably, grieved. But grief has a way of smoothing over inconvenient truths. Cynthia's story, and the story of his son Julian, who was left largely to fend for himself emotionally, were treated as footnotes in the biography of a genius. John Lennon asked the world to give peace a chance. The painful and irrevocable truth is that he was unable to give it to the woman sleeping beside him. His legacy is enormous. His talent was real. But so was the violence. And we owe it to Cynthia to hold both of those things at the same time. If you are finding this as gripping as I think you are, and as important, please, right now, hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Every single like and subscription tells the algorithm that stories like this matter. And it helps us keep making them. Number 4, Peter Sellers. Music, unsettling, slightly comic then sinister. Peter Sellers. Where do you even begin? He was, by any objective measure, one of the most gifted comic actors the world has ever seen. From the bumbling, catastrophically accident-prone Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther films, to the 3 entirely distinct characters he inhabited in Dr. Strangelove, Sellers could disappear so completely into a role that he famously claimed he had no personality of his own at all. To the public, he was a lovable, slightly chaotic eccentric, the kind of brilliant, larger-than-life character that only Britain seems to produce. But for the women who married him, and there were 4 of them, and for the children who called him father, life with Peter Sellers was not a comedy. It was something far closer to a psychological horror film, directed by a man with a terrifying void where his capacity for love should have been. The most well-known of his wives was the beautiful Swedish actress Britt Ekland, whom he swept off her feet in a whirlwind romance in 1964. To the cameras, they were the golden couple of the swinging 60s. To the world, they were glamour personified. Behind closed doors, Sellers was a controlling tyrant of almost operatic proportions. The jealousy was extraordinary. He could not tolerate Eklund receiving professional attention, social attention, or any attention that was not filtered entirely through him. He viewed her not as a partner, but as a reflection of his own ego. And the moment the spotlight shifted away from him, the room would darken. He used his money, his hypochondria, and the constant threat of suicide to trap her. He would stage heart attacks. He would threaten to kill himself if she tried to leave or if she dared to argue back. He smashed furniture. He tore her clothes. He physically assaulted her. And he would do it all with that cold, dead look in his eyes that she later described as the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Not rage, just blankness. As though she were not quite real to him. His children were not spared either. He would wake them in the middle of the night to demand declarations of love, only to scream at them moments later that they were ungrateful and disappointing. He once told his son Michael, with an almost casual cruelty, "I love you, but I don't like you." Peter Sellers died in 1980. And in a final act of spite that was almost poetic in its pettiness, he left the vast majority of his considerable fortune to his fourth wife, leaving his children a sum of roughly £800 each. £800. From a man worth millions. The world mourned a genius. For Britt Eklund and his children, the grief was mixed with something more complicated. Something very close to relief. The laughter of Clouseau will outlive us all. But it was, for his family, the sound of a man hiding the screams of the people he was supposed to protect. Number 5. Dennis Waterman. Music gritty, working class British _. Now, for those of you who grew up in Britain in the 1970s and 80s, Dennis Waterman needs absolutely no introduction. D.S. George Carter in The Sweeney. Terry McCann in Minder. He was the cheeky, fast-talking, hard-drinking Cockney hero who seemed to embody an entire era of British television. He was the lad's lad, the rough diamond. He even sang the theme tunes to his own shows, which, frankly, only added to the legend. Britain loved Dennis Waterman. And for a long time, Britain had no idea what Dennis Waterman was doing at home. His marriage to the actress Rula Lenskau, which began in 1987, was hailed by the press as the union of two television heavyweights. Two icons together. How perfect. It was not perfect. Behind the closed doors of their home, the lovable rogue was frequently replaced by a controlling, alcohol-fueled aggressor whose temper could detonate without warning. The charm that won over millions of viewers was a mask, underneath which sat a deep insecurity and a capacity for violence. But here is what sets Dennis Waterman apart from many of the other men on this list. He admitted it. Publicly. On camera. In 2012. And in doing so, he revealed something about his character that was, if anything, more disturbing than a denial would have been. When asked about striking Rula Lenskau, he did not say he was sorry. He did not express remorse. Instead, he attempted to draw a distinction. He argued that she was not a beaten wife, because she was a strong woman who could fight back. And then came the phrase that stopped the nation in its tracks. "It's not difficult," he said, with breathtaking arrogance, "for a woman to make a man hit her." Let us be absolutely clear about what that statement is. It is victim-blaming. It is gaslighting. And it is one of the oldest tactics in the domestic abuser's playbook. To make the violence the victim's fault. And to make yourself the one who had no choice. Rula Lenskau has described the reality of that marriage as a life lived on permanent eggshells. Waterman's own words remain the most damning evidence against him. Dennis Waterman died in 2022. Remembered fondly by the British television industry he had served for decades. But his legacy is complicated. Profoundly complicated. Because for every woman watching him as Terry McKenna on a Friday night, there was another woman, much closer to him, who had very different reasons to fear that man coming home. Number 6. Paul Gascoigne. Music, emotional, bittersweet. If you were British in the summer of 1990, you remember exactly where you were. Italia 90. England versus West Germany in the semi-final. And a young man from Gateshead, 23 years old, with tears streaming down his face on a football pitch in Turin. Paul Gascoigne, booked, knowing he would miss the final if England got there, crying openly in front of the entire world. And Britain fell in love with him. Completely and utterly. Gazza was not just a footballer. He was a phenomenon. The Clown Prince. The Joker. The man who brought plastic breasts to training sessions and fished for chickens with a rod and line, and made the whole country roar with laughter. He was one of us. He was every one of us. The vulnerable, funny, brilliant boy next door. But behind the tears and the laughter, Paul Gascoigne was fighting private battles that the public were not seeing. A severe addiction to alcohol. A crippling, pathological jealousy. And a capacity for violence that would eventually become impossible to ignore. His marriage to Cheryl Gascoigne began as the love story Britain wanted it to be. She was the stabilizing force. The woman who tried, with extraordinary patience, to keep his feet on the ground as the fame and the pressure mounted around them both. But the pressure broke things. And when it broke badly. In 1996, shortly after Gascoigne's heroics at Euro 96, at the Gleneagles Hotel in Scotland, he attacked Cheryl in a drunken rage. She was left with a fractured finger and severe bruising to her face and arms. The photographs that appeared in the press days later were shocking. Her arm in a cast. Dark glasses hiding the damage to her face. A haunting, silent contradiction to every image the nation had of the laughing, lovable Gaza. And yet, significant sections of the media and the public responded not with anger toward him, but with a kind of bewildered sympathy. They didn't want to believe it. He cried in interviews and blamed the pressure, the addiction, his mental health, all of which may have been true, but none of which erased what he had done to Cheryl. The narrative was always Gaza's battle with his demons. Number 7. Oliver Reed. If you wanted to find the British entertainment industry's most enthusiastic celebration of self-destruction, you needed only to point your camera at Oliver Reed. He was the hellraiser. The professional drinker. The man who would stagger onto chat shows visibly intoxicated, roaring with laughter, spinning tales of legendary pub crawls and barroom brawls. And the audience loved every second of it. He was a character. He was authentic. He was the last of a breed. As an actor, his talent was undeniable. Oliver, Women in Love, and ultimately Gladiator, the film he did not live to finish. He had a raw, visceral power on screen that very few actors ever possess. But here is the question that the chat show hosts never asked. The question the drinking buddies never asked. The question the fans, laughing along at home, never stopped to consider. What was it like to be behind the front door of Oliver Reed's house when the drinking started? His first wife, Kate Byrne, whom he married in 1959, bore the brunt of his early years of excess. In later biographies, a picture emerged of a man who could shift from charming and magnetic to physically violent in a heartbeat, with the alcohol acting as the accelerant on a fire that was always burning underneath. He needed to dominate his environment. He needed to be the unchallenged patriarch. And if that authority was questioned, or if he simply imagined it was being questioned, the consequences for those around him were severe. There were accounts of furniture destroyed in rages that lasted until dawn, of physical assaults, of a man who used his considerable size and intimidating physical presence as a weapon against the people he had promised to protect. What makes Oliver Reed's story so darkly instructive is the way the entire culture around him conspired to enable it. The television producers who booked him knowing he would be drunk. The journalists who wrote admiringly of his excess. The fans who made him famous for the very behavior that made him dangerous. He was a character. And in the British entertainment world, being a character was, for decades, a universal get-out-of-jail-free card. Oliver Reed died in 1999 in a pub in Malta, during the filming of Gladiator. After one final, epic drinking session, he was mourned as an eccentric, a maverick, a great British original. For those who knew the man behind the legend, the grief was more complicated than that. He was a brilliant actor. He was also a man whose addiction left the women in his life picking up the pieces of everything he shattered. We celebrated the monster he played on screen. We celebrated the monster he performed in the pub. And we ignored the monster who existed behind the closed door. Number 8, Freddie Starr. Freddie Starr ate my hamster. If you were alive in Britain in the 1980s, that headline needs no explanation. It was one of the most famous tabloid front pages in history. Completely fabricated, as it happened, but utterly perfect as a summation of everything Freddie Starr was to the British public. He was the madcap clown, the unpredictable genius, the man who could do Elvis one moment and slapstick the next. He was Saturday night television at its most gloriously anarchic. A ball of human energy that seemed to run on a different frequency to everyone else. Britain loved his chaos. Britain found his unpredictability hilarious. His family did not. Behind the doors of his home, Freddie Starr's unpredictability was not a source of amusement. It was a source of dread. The same manic energy that lit up a television studio was, at home, a powder keg. He was capable of switching from warmth to menacing, terrifying aggression without a moment's warning, and without any cause that a rational person could identify. His daughter Jodie later described growing up with him as living with Jekyll and Hyde. She described the sound of his key in the front door as the signal for the temperature in the house to drop. The whole family would brace themselves, waiting, trying to read the mood before it could read them. His ex-wife Donna described their marriage as a sustained catalogue of physical and emotional abuse. On their honeymoon, she alleged, he gave her a black eye because she had looked at another man. Their honeymoon. And that was merely the beginning. He would throw plates of food against the wall. He would use physical violence to reassert control over the most trivial of matters. And then, in the classic cycle of abuse, he would arrive with lavish gifts, flowers, jewelry, holidays, and the cycle would begin again. The psychological toll on his children was immense. His daughter Jodie watched millions of people laugh at the man who made her mother cry. She had to sit with that dissonance. The hero the nation saw, and the monster she knew. Freddie Starr died in 2019, alone in a small apartment in Spain, estranged from much of his family. The obituaries focused on the hamster, on his timing, on those electric Saturday nights. His daughter chose to speak the truth instead. And in doing so, she reminded us of something we very much needed to hear. The energy that lights up a stage can sometimes burn down a home. And the laughter of the audience is often, in those houses, entirely drowned out by the silence of fear. Number 9. Sir Geoffrey Boycott. In the gentleman's game of cricket, very few names command quite the mixture of reverence and irritation that Geoffrey Boycott does. He was the immovable object, the most technically correct batsman of his generation. A man so stubbornly determined at the crease that he became simultaneously the hero and the anti-hero of English cricket. The greatest living Yorkshireman, as he himself was fond of saying. Often, after he retired, he became the voice of the sport on Test Match Special, that beloved Radio 4 institution that has kept cricket fans company on long summer afternoons for generations. His blunt, uncompromising analysis, his trademark caps, his refusal to suffer fools, or bad technique. Gladly. He was a national institution. But in 1996, at the Hotel du Cap in Antibes in the south of France, Geoffrey Boycott did something that no national institution should do. A dispute with his then-girlfriend Margaret Moore, over something as trivial as an unpaid bill and a pillow, escalated into a violent attack that the French court later heard involved him pinning her down and striking her repeatedly in the face. The medical evidence was unambiguous. Photographs showed extensive bruising and blackened eyes that were entirely inconsistent with Boycott's claim that she had simply slipped and fallen. In 1998, a French court convicted him. He received a 3-month suspended sentence and a fine. His response was not remorse. It was not contrition. It was the response of a man who had spent decades being told he was exceptional, and who had come to believe that he was therefore above ordinary moral accountability. He dismissed the verdict. He dismissed the criticism. He told one radio presenter to, in his words, give over, effectively shutting down any further discussion with the breezy arrogance of someone who genuinely could not understand why anyone thought this was relevant. And then, in 2019, the then Prime Minister Theresa May, a self-confessed cricket fan, announced that Geoffrey Boycott was to be knighted. The outrage from domestic violence charities and campaigners was immediate and significant. Women's Aid stated plainly that honoring a man with a conviction for assaulting a woman sent a deeply damaging message to every survivor of domestic abuse in this country. The knighthood went ahead. Sir Geoffrey Boycott, a man convicted of a violent assault on a woman, welcomed into the highest tier of the British honours system, because he had scored a lot of runs, and because the establishment looks after its own. His refusal to acknowledge what he did remains, to this day, a silent wound at the heart of the sport he claims to love so passionately. Number 10. John Thaw. And finally, we come to perhaps the most nuanced, and in some ways the most moving, story on this entire list. John Thaw. Inspector Morse. That beloved, melancholic genius, driving his vintage Jaguar through the honey-colored streets of Oxford, a glass of real ale in his future, an opera on the radio, a mystery to unravel. Thaw brought Morse to life so completely, with such understated intelligence and such genuine warmth, that the character felt less like fiction and more like a very old friend. He won 2 BAFTAs for that role. And before Morse, he had defined the gritty, fast-talking policing of the 1970s as Jack Reagan in The Sweeney. He was, across 4 decades, one of the finest screen actors this country ever produced. A man of immense gravitas and craft. And he was married to one of the finest stage actresses this country ever produced, Dame Sheila Hancock. To the outside world, they were the golden couple of British acting. 2 giants who had found, in each other, a true creative equal. But in her brave, unflinching, and deeply important memoir, The Two of Us, published after his death, Dame Sheila Hancock told a very different story about their early years together. John Thaw, she revealed, was a man in the grip of a severe alcohol addiction. And when he drank, which was often, the quiet, sensitive, introverted man she loved was replaced by someone else. Someone who frightened her. Someone who could become physically abusive. Someone who turned their home into a place where she did not feel safe. She described nights of fleeing the house to escape his temper, of hiding bruises, of the profound, grinding loneliness of being married to a functioning alcoholic who the world saw as a gentle genius. The industry did not help. The hard-drinking actor was, in the 1970s, practically a romantic archetype in British entertainment. His drinking companions saw the fun. His wife saw the cost. But, and this is where John Thaw's story takes a turn that the others on this list do not, he eventually faced the truth about himself. In the late 1980s, facing the real and serious possibility of losing Sheila, and losing his health, John Thaw stopped drinking. completely. And in the last decade of his life, he became, by her account, the gentle, loving, tender man she had first fallen in love with. He died of cancer in 2002, and Britain mourned him deeply and genuinely. Sheila Hancock's memoir did not tear him down. It told the truth about all of him. The darkness and the light. The failure and the redemption. And in doing so, she performed an act of extraordinary public courage, showing us that domestic abuse does not only happen in broken-down homes at the wrong end of town. It can exist behind the velvet curtains of the most privileged and admired lives in the country. John Thaw was not a monster. He was a deeply flawed human being whose addiction unleashed a monstrous side, and who, eventually, found the courage to confront it. His story is the most complicated one on this list, and perhaps, because of that, the most human. 10 men. 10 icons. 10 pedestals that an entire nation built and polished with love. And behind 9 out of 10 of those pedestals, hidden from view, protected by fame, by money, by the culture of the time, and by our own desperate need to believe in heroes, were women living in fear. The names of those women deserve to be said out loud. Diane Cilento, Angie Best, Alex Best, Cynthia Lennon, Britt Eklund, Rula Lenska, Cheryl Gascoigne, Margaret Moore, Sheila Hancock, and the many others whose names we may never know. They were not footnotes. They were not bitter exes. They were not hysterical. They were women who loved, and who suffered, and who, in too many cases, were asked to suffer quietly so that the rest of us could keep our heroes intact. We failed them. The press failed them. The industry failed them. And, if we are honest about it, the culture that we all participated in, the culture that excused the drinking, laughed off the volatility, and elevated the man while erasing the woman, we failed them too. The least we can do, now, is not look away. Not anymore. Talent is extraordinary. Art is extraordinary. But talent is not a character reference. And art does not give any man the right to raise his hand to the person sharing his home and his bed. Remember the art, if you choose to. But remember the whole truth too. That is how we honor the women who were silenced. And that is how we make sure, in our own small way, that it becomes a little harder for this to happen again. If you watched all the way to the end of this video, and I genuinely hope you did, then thank you. It means a great deal. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are not always easy to watch, but they matter enormously. If you found this video thought-provoking, or important, or if it sparked something in you, please take just 1 second to hit the like button. It is the single biggest thing you can do to help this channel reach more people. And if you are not already subscribed, please do it now. We have much more content like this coming. Stories that the history books glossed over. Truths that the newspapers buried. And voices that deserve, finally, to be heard. Subscribe, like, and share this with someone who you think should see it. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.